stimulate a little bit of thought about virus and metaphor, which is another piece that I actually wrote in a book by a colleague, a friend of mine who's a philosophy professor, and and he had asked me to write this piece that I've been thinking about the political metaphors and the cultural metaphors that get used around viral outbreaks and how we think about them. And I think that's critically important in understanding the Ebola outbreak. And I think it's very important in understanding many of the responses that people have had around the world and how we as Americans have interpreted it in myriad ways. So without further ado, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and then I just have a few slides here we go. And I think I will just ask, I think that's all set. Oh, but I'll bet you lost it right there. Did you lose it?
Yes. So, Stephen, we can see, well, so far, keep, there we go.
Yeah. I learned this. So I have two screens here, and I've learned the lesson of how to get that done. I do now all of my lectures to medical students at UMass, but also to the postgraduate residents in Liberia, who I continue to lecture to twice a month at least. And so I've gotten pretty good at this Zoom thing with them. The question that I wanted to ask is, so you have some guy who was a doctor who went to Liberia during the Ebola outbreak, and the question that you should be asking yourself, politely, hopefully, is, so what? Why is this story important, and why does he think I need to know it now? And I think that's the question that I had in mind in the middle of this unprecedented moment in our lives. I mean, the last time there was anything remotely like what we're experiencing in the world is 1918, during what was called the Spanish flu, the influenza pandemic of 1918, for which, if we get to the end, I can name for you several really good books if you're interested in understanding what an outbreak that looks very much like the COVID outbreak is like. There's some really great books that have been written on the topic. But at any rate, the picture that you see here is of the Bong County Ebola Treatment Unit. Bong County is about 100 miles north of Monrovia in a rural part of Liberia. I talk a little bit about the history, at least the recent history of Bong County in my book. This was where we had housed the entire Ebola treatment unit. And so what you're seeing there, looking up a hill, and the road from which this picture is taken is the road that leads to the cemetery, and you'll see a picture of that in a second. So to start out this story, I just want to start out with how I came to be in Liberia, which was back in 2013, just a little bit less than a year before the Ebola outbreak. I explain this further in the book, but I came to Liberia as part of really just a desire to branch out. I had wanted to work in Africa throughout my career, and I kind of got there by hook and by crook, and I found out that there were some people at UMass who were going to Liberia, and I basically just said, can I go? And they said, sure. And my division chief, fortunately, was kind enough to give me a little bit of money for airfare, and I was able to get there. And when I went, I met these two guys right here. I think my mouse is visible to you. The taller gentleman on the right is a man named Phil Ireland. Phil is an internist on faculty now at JFK. He actually got infected with Ebola and would survive. And to his right, to your left, is a man named Zoban Partey, who is now the chief laboratory officer at John F. Kennedy Medical Center. And so what you see there, this picture on the left is JFK Hospital, and then this is one of the long hallways inside the hospital. In 2013, this picture, when I took it, as you can see, it looks fairly Stalinist, almost menacing in its appearance. They've renovated the facade, so it looks a lot better now. But it's still a place that has a lot of material wants. It looks better than it did in 2013. But when I came to Liberia, it was a place that, and I've worked in a lot of places that we call resource limited, but this was really among the most resource limited places where I had worked. Now let's see here. It seems not to want to advance. Oh, there we go. So how did the Ebola outbreak happen? It turns out that there was this this child that you see, I seem to be, there we go. This child right here is Emil Wamunu, who was, as we call it, patient zero, the first person in the outbreak. And we believe that Emil got it inside this tree. What you can't really appreciate about this tree is just how large it is. From this picture, it doesn't give you a human next to it, so you can really get a sense of the size. But this thing is dozens of meters high, and you can get a fully grown person inside that hollow. And the kids used to play in this. This used to be their jungle gym in Gekadu, which is this, the name of the village is Meliandu, and Gekadu is the province in which they were at. Meliandu was a small community of about 300 people. And the kids used to play in this area. Well, way up inside that tree was a nest of bats. And even though it's a nest of bats that have the species of bat that was there has never been associated with Ebola, what we do know is that Emil was almost certainly the first person who got infected. And then he infected his mother, who cared for him. His mother is Sia. She was 7 months pregnant. She would end up miscarrying the baby and then dying of complications. His sister and her daughter, a young girl, Philomene, she would die shortly thereafter. The mother who took care of her also died, and the mother went to a clinic in an outside village, and that's what started the spread of the disease. Etienne Wamunu, who is the husband and the father, he was never sick, and his is a very sad and unfortunate story. You can find some interviews if you look up. There's some BBC interviews with him, and that was really how the outbreak started. And I'm just going to fast forward very quickly because I had been to Liberia when I heard about the outbreak starting. I was fully aware of, and I also, as an infectious disease doctor, I've always been very attuned to viral outbreaks. So I understood very early on what this might mean for West Africa. And that was one of the reasons, it was probably the most important reason why I was one of the very earliest responders in this outbreak, is because I was way, way ahead of most American physicians in understanding how bad this was going to become very quickly. And so in June and July, when most people, even most people in infectious disease, were only vaguely aware of what was going on, I was calling people at the CDC and the World Health Organization trying to find a way over there in what I believed was a responsible way. And that eventually got me there by the end of September of 2014. And when I arrived, you can see these are pictures that I got not long after arriving at the Bong County ETU. And what you can see is there were so many people by that point who were dying that we were laying out these burial markers. And as you can see, some of the burial markers that we had there, and that was, I think, on my first or second day upon arrival. This is the graveyard at the Bong County ETU. So again, this was kind of the other side of that opening picture that you saw if you just turned around and pictured it the other way. Now this picture came from later in the outbreak when you can see there's about 4 rows of people. So there's about 100 people who had died there. And I have to say, as I was preparing this talk, and I was thinking about, sort of parallels to what we're going through now, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is how we Americans are returning to, as we're saying, we're opening up the states. And some are doing it, I think, a little bit more cautiously than others. And one thing that you're seeing is a lot of people that are just opening up states, and they're opening up restaurants and movie theaters and other things without really any care for social distancing or for thinking about what the spread would mean. And I've heard a lot of rationale that, oh, it's going to be, it won't spread because in warmer weather. And so I just want to show you a picture here of, this is Manaus, Brazil. This is last month. Manaus is on the Amazon River, and this is a cemetery that has been, this is literally an impromptu cemetery made as part of the COVID outbreak. So this is a COVID cemetery. This is the equivalent of the Bong County ETU cemetery. And what you can see is Manaus is just as hot and just as humid as Bong County. And so I think Manaus, and for those of you who have been following what's been going on outside the United States, there are some poor tropical humid countries. Brazil is certainly one of the worst hit, Ecuador as well in South America, and now it looks like Nigeria as well is starting to see some real badness. So the idea that heat is going to just make things magically melt away, I think, is part of sort of sense of denial that we're seeing right now, not just in the United States. I think you're seeing it everywhere, but it's just something worth keeping in mind. And this is really sort of where the final tally comes up. This is a picture of me with a child that I've been working with. I think one thing that really becomes important in understanding the dimensions of any outbreak is the isolation that patients feel, and how difficult it is to try to make a connection with your patients when you are hidden behind layers of polymers, as we were in the Ebola outbreak, and we are to a lesser extent, but still a profound extent in the COVID outbreak, particularly when you have to put your face behind an N95 mask. We don't use goggles to the same extent, although there are plenty of nurses, especially who are working in close contact, and they really need to keep themselves fully masked and goggled, and that makes it very hard for them to do what nurses are really outstanding at doing, is providing that human connection that I wish doctors would be better at, but as a group, we're not quite as good. This is also a picture of a different child. This was a child named Blessing, and this was a picture where I was taking her from what we call the suspect ward, when people came in before we knew that they had Ebola, and then we would test them, and then if they were positive, we would take them over to the confirmed ward. If they were negative, we would discharge them. And so Blessing's mother had already left because her test was negative, but Blessing was positive. And so this was a picture of me taking her over into the confirmed ward. She was a very malnourished child. And again, it's the kind of thing that you would say, oh, malnourishment and Africa. But I think what we're seeing a lot in the death rates in Europe, the United States, is a version of malnourishment. It's not the kind of malnourishment that leads you to be lean. And I don't know if you can notice, but her face is really kind of puffy. And that's not because she's overweight, it's because she she's not making enough protein to kind of hold on to the fluid inside her vasculature, and so you get this sort of puffy facial swelling. You don't see that in the United States. What you see is a different kind of nutritional deficit, not a caloric deficit, but basically it's diabetes, and it's a different kind of nutritional deficit, and it's good nutrition, and I think it's certainly one of the major contributing factors to the kind of people who are at highest risk that we have in the United States. This was just a picture I wanted to keep in because this was a picture that showed up in the New York Times. This man is named Genesis Saki. Genesis was, and just to make it clear, these names, I'm using actual names, not violating their privacy, because they had consented to have their names appear in media. They had appeared, most of these are from the New York Times. But I just do want to let everybody know that I take patient privacy quite seriously. Genesis had been one of the early cases. And what happened, and he's another example of somebody who, I think we're actually now seeing a lot of this here, is in order to be discharged from the Ebola treatment unit, you had to have negative tests. I can't remember now whether we had one test or two was required. But the test that is done in the Ebola treatment unit, which is the same kind that we're doing right now to discharge patients from hospitals, like the one in which I work at UMass, it's a PCR test, and PCR, it stands for the amplification of nucleic acid. And what happens is that as you clear an infection, there's lots of leftover kind of bits and pieces of virus. It's a little bit like, you have to think about, I don't know if those of you who have watched the movie 1917 about World War I, where you saw the soldiers cross this landscape of all this leftover war material as the armies move about and abandon sites. And your body is a little bit like that with virus when it's done. And so as a consequence, the PCR test doesn't really look for a working Sherman tank, but it just looks for bits of war material, if I can make an analogy. And so what it means is that even after somebody probably is no longer contagious, they can still have a positive test. And Genesis was a great example of this. And this is happening a lot now in the hospitals, where somebody will survive, they'll get better, and then it's time to go to a nursing home or a rehab facility. And the rehab facilities or the nursing homes, many of them won't take patients back until their test is negative. And their tests kind of linger for up to, in some cases, 1 or 2 weeks. And it's causing a lot of grief and agony. There's this kind of psychological distress, especially about having to stay in the hospital, because it starts to feel like prison. And this picture came the day Genesis had I think it was his third or maybe even his fourth serial follow-up test after he was better. And, the first time we did it, we all tried, when he was better, he was ready to go home, and we tested him and it was positive. And so we had to tell him he had to stick around another 2 days, and then we tested again and it was positive. And then finally we had this picture. And, the joke I had made at the time is I was, Liberia is a very religious place and people are very conversant with their Bible. And so I had said, well, Genesis is waiting for his Exodus. And then when it came back positive the second time, I said, well, he just decided to take a pass on Exodus and go straight to Leviticus. And it was kind of our way of trying to maintain some sense of humor about the situation. But this picture was the day his test was finally negative and he knew he would be going home. And it also, points to just how we need to focus on the positives as healthcare providers, but also for the patients as well, is that hope is, it's a very fragile thing, and but it's also the thing that sustains you and buoys you through, really awful times emotionally for patients and their providers. So that was just a little bit, I just wanted to kind of touch on my personal experience a little bit. I go into my own personal experience at greater length in the book, It's available on Amazon.com. You can help send my children to college if you would like to purchase the book. They unfortunately or fortunately are high school seniors, my twins, and they've been deprived of their high school graduation, and I feel bad for them. So help them go to school, spread the word, and there's my plug for my book, where I talk about this at much greater length. The part I would like to leave you with, which is another theme I deal with in Inferno, and is really what, in many ways, one of the major points that I wanted to use the book to make, because I didn't really want to talk too much about my personal experience, because I didn't think that was the important story that needed to be told. I thought the important story really is thinking about the history of Liberia and how it relates to the history of the United States. And more broadly, you can think about what the Ebola story was in terms of all three of the affected nations, primarily affected nations of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, all of which are former colonies of their colonial masters, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So they all have very close ties to those countries. And how it impacted people here in the United States, in particular, I thought was really important to think about what the Ebola story means. This slide used to say, what is the Ebola story? And the italics was on is, but in this case, in the age of COVID, what I would like to do is not to emphasize the is, and I don't mean to sound like Bill Clinton saying, you know, what's the definition of is, but to put the emphasis on Ebola in this case, is to say what makes Ebola different and how we understood it at the time, and maybe it might give us a window to how we're thinking through and the kind of ways in which people talk about COVID right now. So for those of you who haven't read Richard Preston's book, this is a book about, this was kind of the original blockbuster book about Ebola. It's spine-tingling. It's extremely well written. It is not necessarily the most sober, informative book that's ever been written, but it's great fun. And it had a major impression on me at the time when it was written in 1994. So by all means, don't consider me to be snobby about this book. What I would say, though, is that its goal is to make you scared and not necessarily keep certain things in context. But that's one version of a story, and that really, the hot zone is in major ways one of the most important reasons why people have such a fear reaction to Ebola. And then the hot zone really got sort of turned into the movie Outbreak, which is a mixture of some of the real life things that Richard Preston's book talks about. There was an interesting review on it by A.O. Scott in the New York Times recently. He went back and watched it again, and he pointed out, you know, that this movie just has so many things going on in it besides an Ebola outbreak, that it really is kind of campy in its own way. This is Kevin Spacey, who is now, of course, thoroughly discredited, but this is the role that he played. And what you see here is an over-the-top representation of what Ebola looks like. It's named the Motaba virus in the movie, but I can assure you, having seen patients with Ebola up close and personal, they do not bleed from their eyes or their ears. They don't bleed from their lips. Actually, there's a story I tell in the book where I say that I came in finally one day and I saw a young man who was bleeding from his nose in the confirmed ward, and I was like, oh my gosh, there it is, a guy bleeding from his nose. And I said, your nose is bleeding. And he looked at me and he touched his nose and he looked and saw the blood as if it was just another day at the office for him. And he said, oh yeah, I mean, he said this with his Liberian accent, but he was like, oh yeah, he said, I've had nosebleeds since I was a kid, I'm fine. And I remember feeling quite sort of deflated by that experience. But you know, that's what drives the primal fear, is this bleeding fear. And then, of course, there are other stories that when you talk about things in the context of Africa, you have to think about Heart of Darkness. And what I love about these are older copies of Joseph Conrad's book, which I'm not sure it's on the reading curriculum as much in the 21st century as it was in the late 20th or even the mid 20th, as many of you guys might have read this book as part of assigned reading in high school or college. But one of the things I loved about these two book covers that come from the 50s is that, you have sort of on the left, you have this, the ship going up in this dark, ominous setting. And then, of course, what you have here on the right is in what I think is a 1960s printing, is you have all these eyes, right? You don't have any faces. You just have these eyes looking at you. And I would argue that it contributes to a sort of preconceived notion about Africa as this dark place. Obviously, its nickname being the Dark Continent, which you don't hear as much anymore. And one of the reasons why is because it's not a dark continent, it's just a tropical climate continent. And so when you add all that up, when you think about the Ebola story, I would say that there's three features that add up to a fourth that we never ever talk about and didn't get talked about a lot during the Ebola outbreak. So one is blood, as I've mentioned before from that Kevin Spacey picture. Another is Africa. And as I tried to show facelessness, as you see on that Heart of Darkness cover, and in fact, if you read Heart of Darkness, who's the character? The character is Kurtz. The character is not the Africans. They're really window dressing. And what I would argue is when you add those things up, you get anxiety about slavery. And not directly, but the reverberations, the ripples that came out of that massive 400-year event that really pitted people with light skin against people with dark skin, and all of the ramifications that had for American history. And what are those consequences? Well, some of those things are related to race relations and some of them are not. So one that this may sound like it's getting off topic, but this was just to point out that, there were, I don't know, maybe half a dozen cases of Ebola in the United States. And only, as far as I recall, only 2 that actually were acquired in the United States. Everybody else got flown in. And, people, when I returned to the United States, people were all freaked out about Ebola. Meanwhile, they were doing things to their bodies that had a much higher likelihood of causing their death. Now, COVID is different. And the interesting thing, I think, with COVID was that we had to go in the other direction. We in the public health community had to convince people that, no, this is not just another flu. And I can tell you, having walked now through, my daily job is to walk through an intensive care unit that is 40 beds. And that's just one of the intensive care units with virtually every single patient on a ventilator. I've never seen anything like that in my work in the United States. And so we had sort of the reverse challenge, was getting them to appreciate the risks. Whereas with Ebola, they magnified the risks in the opposite direction. Another thing, though, I think it's really important to understand race and our misreaction, our overreaction to race, and how that's being used by certain politicians as they try to distract and divert attention from the fact that they're not putting a plan in place. And one of the scariest things I think right now as we start to open up states, I have no opposition necessarily to opening up states. I do have an opposition to opening them up without any plans and without messaging of what the plans are. And I think that's because there is no plan. I think the plan in most instances, unless we're in places where we have a relative good governance, is that you're on your own. These are just a couple of the faces of the people, because I think another thing that gets lost sometimes in talks about pandemic is the human toll. Fortunately, if you've been following any of the, there's really a lot of good media, a lot of good newspaper work that's been done. The New York Times is my paper of choice. I don't read the globe perhaps as much as I should, especially in an age where supporting your local institutions is really important. But these are some of the people. Every single person in this picture gets talked about in the book. So just in the interest of time, I said I was going to speak for half an hour, and I'm a few minutes over that. So I'm going to move along, but their stories are still there. Before I finish off, so by the way, that is what I normally look like. And as I finish off, and am willing to, and very happy to